pleasure to be here. As the person introduced, I'm Brian Smith. I'm a human. I'm a learner, and I'm also an academic teacher. And also among that, I'm many other things to many people, including those at Bolton. I'm probably seen as the person coming around checking on teaching and learning in the university. But I've been spending the rest of my life, and my life before, looking at learning and what learning actually means. And I've been making some sense of what the connections are between learning, your presence, your co-presence, and also your sense of being. I've got a mission for the next decade, and I want to unfold your potential, unfold your opportunities to actually show that identity is not just about how you look, it's about how you engage and connect with the actual subject, or perhaps with one another in conversations. This week I read about the Homo floresiens species finally been recognized in human evolution, finally been recognized to be recorded in the family tree. This species in particular has been around for a long time, but they were extinct 50,000 years ago. They were small in size, they were formidable individuals, very good at hunting, like many other species, but yet they had no impact with their community around them. No one took notice of them, apart from when they were actually taking food away from other people. This was remarkable for me because I wanted to understand, where did they go wrong with their identity? Why did it take 50,000 years to get into the human evolution records? This stayed with me as I went from one class to another in my secondary school, where I was actually considering going into history, looking at history in much more detail. And when I walked along to my geometry lesson, which was the next class, I asked myself, what's the connection here between geometry, mathematics, and the evolution of mankind? I wasn't quite sure, but when I entered into this classroom in particular, I realized perhaps I was in the same class as Professor Hopkins. You can see from this particular slide that there's many people in my class who were sitting at the back having conversations perhaps about the history lesson, perhaps about something that's happening outside with them, or perhaps that they were looking forward to the geometry session itself. But in reality, we saw lots of people being hypnotized in my particular class. People hypnotized in the sense that they were falling asleep, not making any sense of the subject that was taking place. Perhaps that's the same today, I'm not quite sure. But as I sat there looking around in the classroom, I became distracted too. As I sat in my seat by the open window, I looked out, and there was a policeman with white rolled-up sleeves, and those of the same age as me will remember this, white rolled-up sleeves, creating a warrior-like effect, trying to direct the traffic from causing any harm to him, or her even. I thought this was unusual, and as I was gazing out the window, all I heard was a volcanic eruption taking place, with the academic looking over his glasses. "Smith, what's the answer to this equation?" Oh, I panicked. I really did panic. But what was interesting was my identity was intact because he called me Smith. I thought maybe my first name has disappeared off the class list. But anyway, as I turned round, I gave this answer. I was really interested in the answer that I gave because he looked there in amazement, or rather bewilderedness, asking himself the question of how did this chap get this question right when he was looking out the window, watching the warrior-like effect take place. But in reality, what was happening is I was standing there watching him, or sitting there watching him in amazement. I wondered how he was able to throw a 6-inch duster across 8 meters of the room with a wind factor of -5 from my open window. I wondered if he learned that skill to be able to throw a chalk duster to hit my head on the right temporal side. It was remarkable how he managed to cultivate those skills. But equally, I asked myself the question, why did he pick on me? Why did he ask me to answer those questions? When there was other people who could actually be taken out of their hypnotized state. But instead, he left them in the classroom, falling asleep in the back of the class. It was sometime afterwards that I managed to have a conversation with this particular academic. And I asked the question, why did you pick on me? Why did you ask me? And I used those words because I did feel as if I was being picked upon. It was the old teaching style of pose the question, pause for the answer, and then ask, pounce for the answer. The answer that I received was remarkable. He told me he was a keen darts player, and he wants to bring that skill into the classroom, and that was his opportunity. But at the same time, he said he wasn't receiving any feedback from the actual group. His identity felt not intact. He was looking for feedback from those who were learning around him. He was looking for a sense of being for himself, but also for the individuals within the room. It felt like a dialogue that was being given, but not received as well. That was quite a remarkable time for me, because I was a very young man at the time. And it changed my identity. The classroom staff, and the classroom students start to call me the Badger. Not quite sure, but it might have been due to the chalk dust that ran down the side of my hair and left impressions ever since. If anybody's confused, by the way, the badger's on the left-hand side. But that was quite remarkable because that identity was stayed with me ever since. And those who know me will call me the Badger fondly outside of the work setting. But identity is something not just about image, it's about much more deep and meaningful engagement. It's about what geometry is. It's about that connection. It's a question of size and shape and the relative position your identity is with the thing that you're looking at or the subject that you're looking at, or perhaps with one another. It's about how do you interconnect? How do you actually unlock that potential and arouse curiosity within both of you to look at the next opportunity that comes ahead? Generations and time went back for me, went on into the 2001. The Sims game came along, and I was quite interested in technology. I was more interested in learners with technology. I was trying to understand how learners were creating identities within the online world. The history of technology with people and their learning was, from my generation, those who are in their 50s will remember this, that we had an Atari console with a Pong game. It was a simple character that went up and down and a ball went back and forward. We thought this was marvelous. This was a breakthrough in our education. But in reality, it was just shaping our behavior for things to come. So when The Sims came along, I started to notice one particular thing about The Sims that aroused my curiosity. And what this curiosity was that people were willing to be online, in households, connecting all over the world, but yet the real playground, the real life experience was outside. So we had no one walking the earth, but everybody was inside playing at real life games, trying to make sense of their identity. They were creating shapes, they were creating images, they were trying to replicate themselves. It still happens today in lots of games that you play. But this actual symbol, this geometry shape, gave me some nightmares because it followed me wherever I went. But I wanted to understand what it meant. And what it meant for me was, it meant something much more deep and meaningful. And I realized it when I was in the health service. I was an academic clinical teacher in healthcare. I was working in critical care at the time. And I observed individuals like this who were putting patients to sleep. I noticed the behaviour patterns of doctors. Doctors in particular were actually creating their identity by standing there, absorbing information, taking their time to actually make a decision about the treatment for that patient. So, what was happening with the other staff? Well, the other staff were actually exercising their collective identity, habit forming, their identity that's associated with their particular group. even to the point that when you watch the people who worked in the operating department, they actually adopted a swagger. They adopted a sort of swagger like this up and down the corridor. And it was unnatural, because when I done some research with operating department practitioners, I noticed that they all entered with a different identity, a different walking method, but they ended up, after qualifying, with this particular swagger. So, I want to give you another example of where identity is critical and really important. This is a real story about Mary. It's not her real name, and this is not Mary's real picture, but this is about Mary, who came into hospital. She was coming in for an eye operation. She was collected by the theatre porter, the hospital porter, who was bringing her along to the operating department where she would have her eye operation undergo. She came along, and she was very quiet when she walked, or when she came into the anaesthetic room. This particular patient was very abrupt in her responses when she was asked certain questions, which was unusual, because the ward nurse actually said this was a very charming, a very engaging lady, someone who knew her identity, someone who was a historian and made a difference to history in the UK as well as globally. But what was interesting was that the hospital policy was to put the patient on a trolley and bring them on a trolley rather than allow them to walk along. They were quite fit and well, they could walk into the operating department, but instead they came along on a trolley. This made her feel vulnerable. This made her feel that she lost her identity. This made her feel that she became the patient, where she wants to be known as Mary. I'm coming in for an eye operation. The practitioner in that particular situation stopped everybody, spoke to Mary quietly and softly, asked Mary to sit up, gave her a chair, sat her in the chair, and talked to her for the best part of 10 minutes. 6 weeks later, Mary came back to the operating department. She walked in, she marched in to the anaesthetic room. She saw the same practitioner. She walked straight to the practitioner and put her arms around and said, "Thank you for giving me my dignity, my sense of being back again. I'm no longer the patient." I was that practitioner. I took that learning and I used that in my teaching today. I have identified in my research that to help us learn, we have to identify ourselves. We have to see who we are. Not just about how we wear things, how we express ourselves. It's about how do we associate ourselves with the subject and with everybody else around us. The connection between identity and presence means that you exercise your voice. It gives you a chance to build your voice so that you can actually share the thought processes that are going on your head. Equally, the co-presence or the feedback mechanism creates the connectivity with people around you and gives you a chance to get into a surface learning mode. These are 3 of 5 that I've identified. I'm going to tell you about 2 in a second. The challenge that we've got is we've got to look at what our status symbols perhaps we're using on Facebook, perhaps what we're using in game theory, etc. What does that mean today for you? Everybody I see on a daily basis has a green symbol above their head, because I'm constantly thinking about how do I keep your identity upmost, keep you in a positive mood. How do I connect you with the subject? How do I connect you with myself? How do I unleash your potential? And what I try to do as well is take you through into the emotional intelligence state of getting you to acknowledge your emotions and your actions towards yourself and towards others. Ultimately, this leads to immersion. If we unfold this actual geometric shape that I've borrowed from The Sims, we can actually map that. We can create a big data set. We can actually show where identity is, presence, co-presence, etc. And what the output of this is, you actually get learners deep into engagement. I'm not saying for one moment that you should go away and start to map yourself against this, but what I'm asking you to do is consider those five conditions, or the 5 levers of learning for your future. If we take those, the chances are that we will be recorded in time. we'll be recorded as the next generation that has made a difference to things like vaccinations, cures, or as you heard earlier today, the chance to feed the world with different types of organic stuff that's out there. I hope that we become the future generation that is known as resilient, creative, employable individuals with integrity, and at utmost the global citizens who can change the world around us. Thank you.